Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. On this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about reparations and why the whole subject is a lost cause. In a previous video, we talked about the Klansman, or Andrew, the president who took over after Lincoln, how he told Frederick Douglass that poor whites, which are the foot soldier of rich whites, so it's all the same, but the poor whites were always the enemies of the Aboriginal people. Well, he said that in the 1860s. In the 1960s, 100 years later, it says that one of Richard Nixon's, the president at the time in the 1960s, his top advisor and a key figure in the Watergate scandal said the war on drugs was created as a political tool to fight blacks. There's a quote from this same president. It says, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people and black people. So again, you got the tippy top white person in the country at the time in the 1960s and in the 1860s saying that so-called black people was the enemy, was the enemy. So if you consider a people or a person your enemy, would you give them money? Would you give them a financial foundation upon which they can use to possibly exact revenge or whatnot? No, you wouldn't do that. That's why everything is the way it is. That's why the jails and prisons is filled with our people, even though we are a small sub percentage of the population. Everything that has been put out by these people that has been detrimental to our people has been because they consider you and me the enemy, the enemy. And that's the words of their presidents, not my words. That's what they said. And then the actions has followed suit with what those two presidents said. So that's why nobody should be talking about reparations or getting anything from any outside group except for ourselves. Any of the resources we need to fix our problems have to come from us. And that's because these people right here consider us enemies. Now, I already explained that they gave reparations to the white slave owners, people like Andrew, who sold his slaves to the government, and then the government used the men to go fight Indians in the so-called Civil War. The women, in the middle of the so-called war, they were setting these people free, paying the slave owners. And then the women, because there were women and kids also at those plantations, they gave those people what was called the Homestead Act of 1862. Was a revolutionary concept for distributing public land in American history. This law turned over vast amounts of the public domain to private citizens. 270 million acres, or 10% of the area of the United States, was claimed and settled under this act. Okay, this is not something that's new. We can go back to while the second Seminole War, so-called Seminole War, was taking place. They passed a law called the Homestead Act in 1841. The government of America passed an act that allowed people to purchase 160 acres of plains land for a very small price. A further act passed in 1862 divided 2.5 million acres of plains land into sections of homesteads of 160 acres. Now, they trying to tell you that all this land was given to these people in the plains area. That's incorrect. That's what they want you to believe. But in a previous video, we talked about how right after the so-called American Revolution, the federal army went over into the Northwest region, which would have been Ohio, Indiana, that area, and they fought the Northwest Indian War that lasted from 1785 to 1795. Well, inside of that war, they did the Land Ordinance of 1785. The Land Ordinance of 1785 was one of the most important pieces of legislation ever passed by the U.S. Congress. It laid the foundation for the U.S. land ownership system. The Land Ordinance described in detail where the survey's beginning point would be located and how to divide the land into townships, squares that measured 6 miles on each side. So again, they were making these townships squares of 6 miles because the plantation and the colony and the settlement would all be like a square log fort. But right here, they were giving out land right inside of going into fighting these Indians in Ohio, called the Ohio Indian War. or Northwest Indian War. But 2 years into the war, they passed the Northwest Ordinance, which set the guidelines for adding states to the Union. So they had to fight the Indians to make a state. So from that point on, they was fighting Indians. So inside of the war of the so-called Civil War, when they was fighting Indians, they gave land away, set the white slaves free, turned the men into soldiers, and put the women on 160 acres of homestead land. That was in the Civil War. Going back in the so-called Second Seminole War, there was the 1841 Homestead Act. Okay, going back before that, in the Northwest Indian War of 1785, you had the land ordinance where they were starting to give away land, starting to cut it up into rectangles. But they also passed a law in 1787 freeing the white slaves in the Northwest area. If you remember, we talked about that on a previous video. So that correlates with the fact that the slaves were set free in the 1862 while the war with Indians was going on. They also did it in the Northwest region in the 1780s while a war was going on with Indians. There's always a pattern to what they do. The so-called slaves, the white slaves that was on these plantations, they already was given reparations with the land. So the pattern of this whole thing is that in the 1780s, when they went over inland, where the white folks were being lumps, they called it lumping. You know, some of them went to Lumpkins jail because they were too unruly. Well, they were giving the land out inside of that war because that was the payment for those white slaves that they freed in 1787. That was the incentive. They were freed and then they joined the military to fight the Indians. They did that in the 1780s and 1790s. Because in 1792, they passed a law that said every white, able-bodied white man from 18 to 45 had to have a gun and join the militia. They right away built the militias up with the ex-slaves that they had freed in that area. They did the same thing in the South. And that's the pattern. That's the incentive. The incentive inside of the so-called Seminole War in the 1841 was the Homestead Act. They started giving land to get more soldiers because that's what they needed to fight the Indians. They did the same thing in 1860s. They freed the so-called white slaves, paid the white slave owners, militarized the men, and then gave the women and the children 160 acres of homestead land as an incentive. That's what they do. And they do that because that's how you colonize an area. It's not a plantation where you plant crops in the ground. It's where you plant people to colonize the area and make a nation. These people not only make nations, they make whole continents. Okay, before they made Europe, Europe was North Africa. It was filled with those same kind of looking people in that area. And so the thing that's going on here in America with colonization started over there in the so-called European continent. So there is no reparations for white slaves. Let me reiterate a little bit here. So we're dealing with 3 wars, all presumably between Aboriginals and invading colonizers. The Northwest Indian Wars, the Second Seminole War, and the Civil War all have documented acts where they were giving away acres of land in the Land Ordinance and the Homestead Acts. And then the Northwest Indian Wars and the Civil War is both documented where they were releasing and freeing the white slaves. But in the Second Seminole War right here from 1835 to 1842, we don't really have a document that shows where white slaves were being freed. So we're going to have to use some of the previously learned information to put this together. So the white slaves would run away from the forts or the plantations where other whites were the owners and go take their chances with the so-called Native Americans. That's what the book says. So they would run away a lot and go be a slave to the Indians. And it said that Florida was a place that they like to go to, like they would like to run to because it would be a safe zone for them, even though they would continue to be somebody's slave down there. So during this Second Seminole War, a year before it ended, they gave a bunch of land away. Prior to that, there was what we would call the Trail of Tears from 1838, which happened 3 years into the Second Seminole War. So I'm saying that during that time in between 1835 and 1841, there was some Aboriginal fortresses taken over, some white people were freed, and some Aboriginals were ran out of their territorial land right around from 1835 to 1841. And that's why the 1841 Homestead Act was produced, because of the white people that just had been freed from the area of Florida during the Second Seminole War.